which brings me to a very interesting point that you make in your book uh, on probably whether there is a need for, or probably is there a time to rethink constitutional reforms. You introspect and talk a lot about the Westminster model, actually, of parliamentary democracy uh, being kind of de jure, not de, if not de jure, but then de facto replaced by the presidential model. So that's something, an observation which you make. So now that when you say that it was the prime minister who carried the message so clearly, what do you think about this kind of feature playing out in India and the rest of the world?
So, Mehdi, you have raised an important issue, which I touch in my book in some detail, particularly if you look at the chapter on the evolution of the Prime Minister's office, the relationship between the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's office. I do point out that initially, in the first few years of our independence, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru really was served by what Lord Wavell had described in a letter which he had written, to say that the Cabinet Office, namely the Secretary to the Cabinet, was also the principal private secretary to the Prime Minister. And he writes, with perhaps tongue in cheek, that this was to deliberately prevent Nehru from going astray and from the institution of the Cabinet Office being in any way diluted. This tradition continued for very long. It continued till the diminutive Lal Bahadur Shastri decided to appoint NK Jha for the first time as Secretary to the Prime Minister. Namely, the Secretary to the Prime Minister then had an identity distinct from the Cabinet Secretary. And for the first time at that time, which I have mentioned in the book, Vaidi, the rules of transaction of business were amended. They were amended to have a new insert in the rules, namely the recognition of the Prime Minister's office as an entity recognized under the transaction of business rules. That was, if you ask me, a watershed point. Now, over a period of time, the relationship between the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's office has been an evolving dynamics, depending on the temperament and depending on the needs of the time. They have settled a kind of a working equilibrium. But let's not forget two important things. First, which you have mentioned, is about what are the global tendencies. If we look at global tendencies, you are seeing the emergence of strong leaders as prime ministers. How many of us thought that the electoral mandate in the United Kingdom was being sought in the name of who was the likely Home Secretary or who was going to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer? They knew that the candidate for the Prime Minister in the United Kingdom was Boris Johnson. And if we look at other patterns too, in some ways, this is beginning to already dilute the traditional Westminster model, because the Westminster model is based on one central principle: the Prime Minister is the first among equals. The moment that is really altered, you altered the gene particles of the Westminster model. And why is this so? This is because, after all, votes are garnered, votes are realized, elections are won on the basis of who is going to lead the country. It's of hardly much relevance to an average voter, increasingly, in a world and in a society so interdependent by the power of the media, by the power of technology, by the power of what expectations are, by aspirations are. It does not matter what kind of a governance institutional framework he has. What matters to him is who is more likely to deliver on the aspirations which they expect from any elected government. And the altered nature of technology and aspirations have to a large extent been important factors in diluting the traditional rubric of the Westminster model. And as you have mentioned, and I mentioned this in my book, if not de jure, then de facto. And it is this unsettled equilibrium in which the cabinet office then increasingly becomes the traditional role, namely the cabinet secretary is the secretary to the council of ministers. The secretary to the prime minister is to carry out the orders, initiatives of the prime minister. So this is really, if you ask me, the new model which seems to be emerging globally. By the way, not only in terms of the management of the central government, powerful chief ministers who have been successful chief ministers have also adopted the similar replication of this model. Whatever that might mean, it must mean that who are the entities, who is the leader, in whom the voters have demonstrated not only their support, but have opted for. So it is the changing voter psychology all over the world, which has been the most important guiding factor in moving away from whatever traditional models of governance which we may have. And by the way, the pandemic has demonstrated one more thing, which I have brought out in my chapter on pandemic and beyond, namely that the very important role of a central unifying factor in being able to work out social security systems, in expectations that in the post-pandemic period, you may have to do a reset button. You may have, in fact, to write a new social contract, a social contract which embeds many more features than the traditional social contract has.